Breaking tonight as we mark 13 years since the 9/11 attacks on America, the commander-in-chief announces we are unleashing an air campaign on Syria designed to eviscerate the terror army ISIS. No sooner had that announcement come than Secretary of State John Kerry claimed America is not at war. And why are we bombing Syria, sir? Welcome to the Kelly File, everyone. I'm Megyn Kelly. 13 years ago, America was forever changed when a hijacked plane hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center in downtown Manhattan. 3 more planes would be hijacked for use as weapons that day. Thousands of innocents would die, and America would be dragged into the war on terror. First came Afghanistan, and then later the war in Iraq. That one was arguable from the start. But believe in it or not, we did it. And though we needed to end it, we needed to end it right. Our generals in the field urged President Obama to keep nearly 30,000 troops in Iraq to preserve the gains we had made. The president ultimately left not a single soldier there. And the terror group ISIS grew like a cancer. They have now established the equivalent of their own country. And our defense secretary says they compare to nothing we have ever seen. Weeks ago, President Obama said he had no strategy for defeating this group until his poll numbers plummeted. And then last night, the man who says he was elected to end wars seemed to announce he was starting a new one.
As Commander-in-Chief, my highest priority is the security of the American people. Our objective is clear. We will degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL. First, we will conduct a systematic campaign of airstrikes against these terrorists. Second, we will increase our support to fighting these terrorists on the ground. We will send an additional 475 service members to Iraq. Third, we will continue to draw on our substantial counterterrorism capabilities to prevent ISIL attacks. This counterterrorism campaign will be waged through a steady, relentless effort to take out ISIL wherever they exist.
It sounded like a battle cry. But then late today, the Secretary of State comes out with this.
We're engaged in a major counterterrorism operation, and it's going to be a long-term counterterrorism operation. I think war is the wrong terminology and analogy. I don't think people need to get into war fever on this.
Joining me now, Mark Thiessen, a former speechwriter for President George W. Bush and a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and Pete Hegseth, who's an Iraq and Afghanistan war veteran and Fox News contributor and CEO of Concerned Veterans for America. Mark, let me start with you. As the former chief speechwriter for President Bush, as the man who wrote that speech that we have now played and that has been seen by nearly 40 million Americans, where he predicted all of the things that are happening right now in Iraq if we withdrew too soon, why does the language matter?
Well, the language matters a lot. And by the way, that came directly from President Bush. I don't want to take credit for writing it. The president told us he wanted to lay out the consequences of what would happen if we left, and we did it. I took dictation. But the words matter a lot because, look, number one, when Secretary Kerry goes out and says that we're not at war with ISIL, that doesn't send a message of resolve. And two, it sends a message to the world that we don't know what we're doing. I mean, we are operating under the laws of war. Bombing in a foreign country is an act of war. You are either under the laws of war or you are not under the laws of war. You can't have it both ways.
But what is the evidence of that? I mean, you know, to call it an act of war, I mean, we've gone over, we bombed Libya, we've unleashed air campaigns in other countries without designating them wars. Why do we need to label this a war, and why is it such a kerfuffle when Secretary of State Kerry says this isn't one?
Well, it's interesting because in that very same interview where Secretary Kerry said we are not at war, he also said that President Obama didn't need to go to Congress because he already had an authorization for the use of military force. There are actually 2 authorizations for the use of military force. The 2001 authorization after the 9/11 attacks, and second, the 2002 authorization for the war in Iraq. The first one mentions war 4 times. The second one mentions war 9 times. So how can Secretary Kerry say we are not at war when the resolutions he is citing from Congress say we are at war?
These authorizations for the use of military force are the exact document that this president is now relying on to unleash this military campaign on Syria. But here is the president in May of 2013. May of 2013, talking about those very authorizations and what he thought should happen to them. Listen.
Unless we discipline our thinking, our definitions, our actions, we may be drawn into more wars we don't need to fight. So I look forward to engaging Congress and the American people in efforts to refine and ultimately repeal the AUMF's mandate.
He went another way.
Now he's relying on them because he was the president. Back then he was the president who was going to end wars, and now he's starting the war that's not really a war. And look, I think the fascinating thing here is that they seem to think that if you don't send ground troops, that means it's not a war. Like they're making a distinction with the Bush administration that we're not sending ground troops into Iraq, so that makes it less of a war. You know, 13 years ago today, Al-Qaeda attacked us with planes. Was that not an act of war? War isn't defined by whether you have ground forces or not. Our Air Force and Navy pilots are combat forces that are bombing a foreign country. It's an act of war.
You know,
if you can't even say what you're doing, how are you going to prosecute it in a way that's going to win? We need resolve. We need to send a message of resolve to the enemy, and we need to carry out this war and defeat the enemy.
It raises a good point, Pete, because, you know, Congress hasn't officially declared war since June of 1942. But tell that to guys like you who actually risked your lives on the battlefields in Iraq and Afghanistan, and tell it to the guys who are going to have to do this military campaign in Syria and actually go in nearly 500 more troops to Iraq pursuant to last night's announcement.
That's the first thing I think about. So you hear a speech like last night, and I keep wanting to invest in my commander-in-chief. I keep wanting to think he's going to give a speech to rally the American people, to tell it like it is, to defeat this enemy. And in some ways he did last night. 450 troops, not enough. Didn't call the Islamic State Islamist. I was disappointed in a few things, but it was a forceful speech. And then today they do everything they can, from Secretary Kerry to Josh Earnest, to walk back and say, but wait. This isn't a war. We are not at war. They've declared war on us.
We don't need to get war fever.
We don't need to get to war fever, Megan. So we've been suffering apparently from war fatigue, and we're war weary as a nation. Now we're worried about war fever. What we want, I've got a fever for justice. I've got a fever for success. I've got a fever to defeat the enemy. Not because I want war. No one who's seen it wants it. But that guy on the ground right now, those 475 going to Iraq, they deserve a mission, they deserve clarity, and they deserve a president who will say what they're going to do clearly, which is they're going to war on behalf of the interests of this nation to defeat a vicious terrorist army. Not just a terrorist group, a terrorist army.
Is there some belief that if they label it as something else, that they will convert it into something else? Because as you point out, okay, so this is not a war. The Islamic State is not Islamic, nor are they a state. Fort Hood was workplace violence, and it wasn't terrorism. He claims he called Benghazi a terror attack the day after, but he didn't actually do that. You know, I mean, is there some belief, do you think, that if you just say it's something else, you can make it something else?
Yeah, yes, are they realists? Are they're the idealists? They're fantasists. I believe they have their own fantasy world of the way the world is. They want to say if we just tell it as is, that's what exists.
But having said that, however they label it, do you believe in what he set out last night militarily? Do you believe he has the right plan now?
I don't think he has the right plan right now. He has the right rhetoric about destroying. We're going to need more boots. We're going to need more commitment. The question is, Megan, 2 weeks from now, 4 weeks from now, will he come out and give another speech? Will he rally the American people to this cause? Will he really form a coalition of people who want to follow a president who just laid it out and now declares it's not a war? How do you build a coalition, a serious coalition around that? The proof will be in the pudding.
And before I let you go, Mark Thiessen, that's what President Bush did when things were going as bad as they could possibly go in Iraq and the American public wanted us out. That's when he made those remarks about the damage we would be doing if we did it. That's when the chips are down, when things don't go the way we hope that they will. What does the commander-in-chief do then? I'll give you the last word.
Well, you know, what's interesting is when President Bush announced the surge, he actually stepped up and said, I take responsibility for the fact that the strategy isn't working. And here's how it's going to change. Here's what we've learned. Here's what we were doing wrong. And here's how we're going to fix it. And he laid out specific steps. President Obama never said that the strategy wasn't working. He never took responsibility for the fact that ISIS rose on his watch because he did nothing. He said we're not going to allow him a safe haven, but he did nothing for 5 years while they built the safe haven. So he should have stepped up and said, our strategy wasn't working. Here's how we're fixing it, and this is what we're going to do now, and taking responsibility.
Mark, Pete, thank you.